Excellent prophetic analysis. The Dictatorship of Numbers in Geopolitical Correlations. This was first published last year. Excellent and prophetic analysis explained what is really going on in the world, why Europe is being destroyed by the US, and why a collapsing USA will lose the game even if it leads to nuclear mayhem. Let's remember this was published 25th April 2021, long before the Nordstream pipeline and the energy crisis going on in Europe. Now, only schizophrenic Russophobes and NATO pseudo-historians cannot see the real situation, and they are fooling the world through the media. The Dictatorship in Numbers in Geopolitical Correlation, following a conversation with Paul Craig Roberts, Andrei Martynov, April 21st, 2021. The following article is an extensive but rather rare update of validity, training and thoroughness, and technical coolness on today's global seismic geopolitical reality, the momentum of tectonic shifts, and the geopolitical landscape that tends to take shape for the coming generations if awarded the passage of those affected by the losses do not trigger the Holocaust of the nuclear war of the planet. Its author is a Russian-American CEO of a commercial aerospace group, a former Russian naval officer who was born in Baku in 1963, studied at the Russian Naval Academy, and immigrated to the US in the 1990s. That's after the fall of the Soviet Union, obviously. He's the author of a series of sought-after strategy books and internationally recognized as an undisputed validity source for geostrategic information, translated by Michael Stylianou. So here are some numbers. We'll start with 447 million and 4.67 billion. These two numbers speak volumes and are at the foundation of America's decline and increasing irrational behavior, which may bring us to the proverbial "you ain't seen nothing yet" point. The first number is the population of the European Union, 447 million, while the second is the population of Asia, 4.67 billion. The population of Asia constitutes about 60% of the world's population. Second to this number is Africa with about 1.37 billion, and third is Latin America and the Caribbean with a respectable 659 million people, which is significantly more than the population of the European Union. North America is about 371 million, a figure that in the larger context of things does not seem so impressive. Actually, it's not. The history of colonialism, I purposely omit the Western specificity here, because there were all kinds of colonialism as they related to classical capitalism, was more than the exploitation of the colonies for the benefit of the metropolis. While the images of extracting natural resources from colonies and shipping them to metropolises are correct, they do not form a complete picture. In the end, the colonies were seen as markets where the metropolis would sell its products. The larger the colony, the more numerous its population, the greater the market for products produced in metropolises. All of this made complete, if often bloody, economic sense in the era of good industrial capitalism, when the metropolis would take resources from the colony and turn them into a final product, and then ship that final product with enormous added value to be sold in the colony. For the Native Americans who sold Manhattan to the Dutch in 1626, for, it is said, hotly contested by historians, $24 worth of manufactured goods, or whatever else was offered, was of enormous value to them because they could not produce these objects, whether they were, as the mythology states, shiny glass gifts or any other such much more technologically advanced Dutch product. This is more or less how trade has worked for centuries. The more and better items one produced, the richer one would become. That is until the economy of fire and the mockery of post-industrialism were revealed to the world by people, most of whom would have a hard time passing the contractor trades exam, let alone getting a degree in industrial engineering. Fast forward to May 2000 and the passage by the U.S. House of Bill 4444 on trade with China. In one of the most profoundly mindless and ignorant statements of American foreign and economic policy, Bill Clinton declared that, quote, "Today, the House of Representatives took a historic step towards continued prosperity in America, reform in China, and peace in the world. If the Senate votes, as the House just did, to extend permanent normal trade relations with China, it will open new doors of trade for America and new hopes for change in China. 7 years ago, when I became president, I charted a new course, a new economy, a path of fiscal discipline, investment in our people, and open trade. I have always believed that by opening markets abroad, we open opportunities at home. We have worked hard to advance this goal of more open and fairer trade since 1993, until the landmark legislation I signed just a few days ago to expand trade with Africa and the Caribbean basin. Deplorable in its utter artificiality and unbearable passion, the economic equivalent of Chamberlain's 1938 Peace in Our Time proclamation, after the signing of the Munich capitulation to Hitler, Clinton's statement shook even those who otherwise would not have given a damn. Great attention to the financial affairs of the United States. China was not upset. Why bother? Both NAFTA and China's entry into the World Trade Organization served as a giant vacuum cleaner that sucked the life out of American industries. And to be clear, the ones being moved overseas were not banking or financial advisory industries. American industry began to leave its shores. America began to lose the one tool that was, and even today, remains the only reliable means of achieving economic prosperity, productive capacity. A concept that is beyond the control of most American economists and political pseudoscientists, most of whom today wear Chinese suits, have iPhones made in China, and use laptops and computers packaged there. To be precise, America still produces some things, civil aircraft, for example, but since the whole Boeing 737 MAX affair, which can only be described with the strongest profanity, the sheen from Boeing's polished external facade has largely worn off, and the strong underpinnings of American commercial aviation having de facto lost the competition with EU rival Airbus. Cars, for sure. America is still competitive in truck manufacturing. The rest, America's sedans, are not competitive and are losing out to Japanese and Korean automakers, both domestically and internationally, enough to take a look at the loss of the Russian market to Asia, Russia, and EU automakers, with the latter Ford Focus factory to close recently in Russia. In other rather surprising developments, America's main soft power export, Hollywood, is losing its penetration power to China and Russia. In fact, it's not just that he's going to lose her, he's already lost her. If such a diagnosis would have been ridiculed 20 years ago, the fact that the Russian films dominate the Russian box office today is accepted as completely normal. The same is true of the Chinese film market, so much so that Hollywood is forced to bow to China in order to have a shot at the giant Chinese film audience. Even before the pandemic, Hollywood's performance was unimpressive and in decline. Hollywood's values of a radical feminism, anti-male misogyny, and promotion of sexual deviance are not in demand in mainly conservative Chinese and Russian societies. To be sure, there are certain items the United States manufactures today that are in demand, or if we want to speak realistically, forcefully imposed on customers. America's vastly overpriced and of dubious effectiveness weapon systems. This is what is left of America's once mighty industrial site that could produce everything from socks and electric stoves to fine fighters and super commercial aircraft. Today, that capability no longer exists, since China is the world's leading manufacturer of consumer goods, and the only way the United States is able to secure any market for its weapons is to keep Europe, that is, the NATO, as the main client and vassal. NATO is very willing, and if not, color revolutions are a good tool to convince those who have reservations to buy Europe's weapons and defense, but America needs the Europeans to believe that the hordes of regressive, bearded, democratically hating, bisexual, regressive Ivan Russians ready to rush to strip Europe of its cherished values of complete sexual depravity, its cities aka filthy multicultural dumps, and its economy those that decline for reasons that only the Americans know, while the vast majority of Russians, especially the Russian youth, do not want to define themselves as Europeans. So to convince those 447 million European residents that they need Americans' protection and weapons, America needs Russia to go to war with Ukraine, and if Ukraine ends up with the complete destruction of its armed forces and in all probability of its statehood, and it will if Russia really decides to do so, you don't get bored, so be it. Americans have never really cared how many natives die as long as U.S. interests are served or America's position, which is steadily getting worse, because not only does the United States have less and less substance, hence high added value to sell to the world, but because the emerging economic and military monster of Eurasia is displacing the U.S. from the initially overemphasized self-styled status of world hegemony to the status of one of the big ones on the planet, at best. At worst, the United States is removed from Eurasia as a viable competitor and relegated to the status of a regional power, still strong relative to its continental neighbors, but lacking in that second volume of 4.67 billion, Asia. This is a large part of the population and consumers. Now imagine if the United States loses the EU, suddenly 4.6 billion becomes 4.6 billion plus 446 million, which equals 5.117 billion, or 65% of the Earth's population. It's a huge majority of the world's population, and more importantly, a large part of its population can pay for goods, unlike the gigantic population of Africa. Furthermore, this population is concentrated within a single landmass separated from the United States by two oceans. The United States cannot allow this market consolidation to happen and the loss of Europe, which Washington's thinking says amounts to capitulation. Therefore, the United States must keep the EU, or whatever the EU becomes, once it inevitably collapses, and NATO remains the only tool to subdue the weak Europeans. Pushing Russia to wipe out the Ukrainian armed forces is a perfect way to terrorize the Europeans into abandoning any attempt to compete economically with the United States and deny them access to Russian energy. You see how prophetic this is? This was written in April of 2021. And going back to the article, given an extremely low level of Western education in the field of practical geopolitics and his pseudoscientific offspring, geoeconomics, which has failed over the past 30 years to come up with even the vaguest description of the emerging world, it does not matter whether the United States are they keeping Europe or not anymore. The reason for the utter failure of these academic predictions and subsequent policies are numerous, but a few are worth pointing out. 1. Europe is no longer a critical trading partner for Russia, and mutual trade has plummeted in recent years. This trend will continue and is not only due to American pressure on the EU, although that too, but is a result of the steady change in both Russia's economic model and its reorientation towards Asia, which is now largely complete. A degree. Russia simply no longer needs many of the goods it used to buy from Europe. The policy of import substitution is on average successful, and Russia's economic alienation from the West will continue. 2. The much-discussed Nordstream 2 pipeline is no longer a critical economic project for Russia, and as we said last week, it was blown up. Nord Stream 1 and 2. Russia can absorb the losses if the plan is ultimately undermined by the United States, and its European sidekick like Poland. Again, let's remember that this article was written the end of April of last year. And it's talking about the taking out of Nordstream 2, which has taken place. But for Germany and the EU in general, this sabotage will lead to disaster due to the suicidal energy policies of the European Greens, which make the cost of European goods highly dependent on energy. In reality, America's efforts to sabotage Nord Stream 2 are directed primarily against the EU in general, and Germany in particular, not against Russia per se. 3. The United States lost the arms race. America's arms acquisition process and military doctrine can no longer be seen as a normal, rational, and justifiable process, while still able to produce some state-of-the-art platforms and enablers such as signal processing, combat computers, communication networks, and reconnaissance means. In terms of actual weapons, the United States is beginning to lag behind Russia, not only in years, but also in generations. The Congressional Budget Office report on missile defense recently admitted in February 2021 that the United States is defenseless against a barrage of Russian cruise missiles and that there is nothing to stop them. There's nothing that does not exist. U.S. air defense systems lag dramatically behind Russia in this, and the gap is widening, with Russia's S-500s entering continuously production and at least S-350s already deployed in frontline units. The United States simply cannot develop modern hypersonic naval missiles, and the U.S. Navy is inexplicably forced to purchase the Norwegian Kongsberg naval attack missile, a disappointing subsonic missile that is not on par with modern hypersonic and hypersonic weapons of mass destruction that is being developed by Russia and is not viable in the modern air defense and ECM environment. 5. Finally, the intellectual level and level of awareness of contemporary American elites is at precipitous decline, which inevitably led to the embarrassment of the last American election, especially the scandalous debate between two geriatric candidates in 2020, which showed the USA as a lowly, unsightly spectacle. The consequent loss of legitimacy and further confirmation of America's status as an entity incapable of agreement hardly serve as boosters to America's already tarnished reputation as a big-mouthed baboon with an uneducated and uncultured ruling class. The United States already does not merit certain criteria that are imperative for superpower status, among which the military is crucial. If in 2014 some American military strategists still harbored a suicidal idea for fighting Russia conveniently in Ukraine, today in 2021 such an idea is completely insane, because the United States cannot win a conventional war in Russia's region, and any American force will be annihilated. This leaves the United States with only two options. 1, believing their own propaganda, try to unleash chaos in Ukraine, provoke Russia into an immediate military operation, and then bring whatever forces the US and NATO can muster into the theater of operations. Any such plan is bound to fail miserably, as not only would such a force be annihilated, but participating NATO nations would face the prospect of having their military installations destroyed by very long-range weapons at hand. This raises the possibility of the US escalation to the nuclear level, meaning the United States may cease to exist as a country. This is an undesirable plan, and the majority of US policymakers understand what it means and rule it out. Despite some serious cases of psychological Russophobic disorders that abound in America's current administration and elites. So while not completely impossible, the likelihood of such a plan being implemented is pretty low, not to mention the fact that for the US to conventionally fight around Russia would require buildup of force that would eclipse that assembled of the first Gulf War. There, the United States took almost 6 months to achieve it. 2, so what is realistically left to push is to push Ukraine into the suicide campaign, with Russia being denounced as the aggressor before the first shots are even fired. What the United States fails to recognize is the fact that this loosens the hands of Russia, which already has an overwhelming escalation advantage, not only over Ukraine, but over anything that might be attempting its terms of supporting the paranoid Kiev regime. Russia has many options. The United States has one. It needs a war in Donbass, which, according to Washington's thinking, will allow the Europeans to be forced into submission, which is supposed to allow the United States to save its hegemonic position there. But they will not succeed even if Europe is brought into submission. The United States today has a unique resource that allows it to remain a factor: virtual reality through both printing money and media propaganda, which is increasingly ineffective. One could hide America's crumbling cities, the mass riots, the destruction of the education system, the incompetence of the top brass, political and military and suicide bombings, brutal practices, and the breakdown of law and order, exacerbated by huge queues at time-only food banks. Now, all this is in plain sight, and even the subjugation of Europe and the alleged opening of the markets of Europe to these few articles which the United States can still supply to its customers there, do not change the fact the United States, as it exists today, has no future with or without Europe, and that it still has to reckon with China's massive manufacturing capacity and Russia's advanced military power, leading to the unification of the Eurasian market, whether the United States goes to war in Ukraine or not. Even without the EU, this market minimizes what the US will be able to salvage in order to avoid being downgraded. It cannot stop a process that has been going on for years when Russia, after the bloody coup in Ukraine, realized that there is no one to talk to in the combined West, which, in addition to losing its military and economic power, began to disintegrate from within due to Western societies becoming more and more totalitarian and unable to face the reality that we still live in the highly industrialized world that needs energy, industrial facilities, and weapons to defend them. Both China and Russia seem to be piling it all on, and with them, the fate of the United States is sealed. Bill Clinton may have thought that 2000 charted the new course for a new economy. Too bad for him and for the US. The new economy, it turned out old. What, do you think jeans, cell phones, and rockets grew on trees? Did you? And this I've translated for you from Greek article. You can see that it's prophetic turned out a year ago exactly, and this is the plan. And they won't be able to stop it. Europe cannot afford the few things that America wants to sell. And what do you think? Anyway, give me your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.